Well, Borda, thank you very much for joining me today. This morning, I published the Welsh Government's final budget for 24-25. I want to share with you some of the details of that package and talk to you about the increasingly urgent need for greater budget flexibilities. The final budget updates the draft budget proposals, which we published in December. You'll remember that we were facing the most difficult financial situation since the start of devolution when we set that draft budget. The impact of persistently high inflation meant that our budget was worth £1.3 billion less in real terms than it was at the point at which it was set by the UK government in 2021. In developing our draft budget, we were faced with a series of stark and painful choices, because our funding settlement is simply not sufficient to respond to all of the pressures that public services, businesses, individuals and all of the other organisations who rely on Welsh Government funding are facing. Our budget proposals for 24-25 have been designed to protect the core public services that we all rely on as far as possible. We radically restructured our spending plans to focus funding towards frontline NHS services, to the local government settlement, to protect funding for schools, and to maintain BPS payments for farmers for next year. We have provided an extra £450 million for the NHS in 24-25, which means that we will be increasing the funding for the health service in Wales by more than 4% next year, compared to less than 1% in England. Spending more in some areas means that we have to spend less in others, including in those non-devolved areas where we have traditionally stepped in to make up for the shortcomings of UK government funding. But even though we will be spending more in these core areas on the things that people tell us matter to them the most, our public services face a very difficult year ahead as they manage the twin pressures of increased demand and costs. Typically, we do not make many changes between our draft and final budget. Sometimes we make technical changes or we make changes to respond to the issues that we hear in scrutiny. But this time we're making more changes than usual because in the last couple of weeks, the UK government has finally given us further detail on the funding consequentials we will receive as a result of the decisions that it has made to increase spending in devolved areas in England in this financial year. Including the financial transactions capital allocations that I had planned to make at the final budget, it means that we can make almost £190 million of extra allocations in the final budget. And it also means that I can provide for a very modest in-year reserve, which will provide more scope to respond to urgent issues next year. In making new allocations to the final budget, we have listened to the key messages which have been coming through in scrutiny. The additional allocations that we're making are focused on those areas where the pressures are most severe, or where reductions would not have been made at the draft budget had we known about the intended consequential funding. There will be £14.4 million extra for local government to help it meet the pressures in social care and schools, and we're reversing cuts that were made to both the Social Care Workforce Grant and the Children and Communities Grant. The additional funding for local government means that no council will have less than a 2.3% uplift in their settlement. An extra £10 million will be available to strengthen apprenticeship and employability programmes, making sure that we are ready to support steelworkers if Tata closes its blast furnaces at Port Talbot. There is £40 million of new capital funding to support the NHS, and the final budget confirms the £30 million package for the Holyhead Breakwater and a new £20 million fund to help support small and medium-sized businesses future-proof their business. We're also making some additional allocations to our shared cooperation agreement priorities, including constitutional reform work and housing projects. I want to thank Sian Gwentlian, the lead designated member for the cooperation agreement, for the constructive working relationship that we've had during this difficult budget round. This year, as in previous years, we have seen significant changes to our budget very late in the financial year. This makes it difficult for us to plan properly, with knock-on consequences for other public sector organisations. We also face rigid limits on our ability to carry forward or draw down funds from our reserves, and this hampers our ability to plan ahead and respond to changing circumstances. And there is something fundamentally wrong with the UK's funded arrangements which allow this to happen. I have repeatedly called for increased budget flexibilities to enable us to manage our funding more effectively in line with Wales's needs. This includes indexing our borrowing and overall reserve limits to inflation and removing the limits on the amount that we can draw down from our reserves in any given year. These flexibilities are available to Scotland, and recent increases to the agreed Northern Ireland annual capital borrowing limit are far more generous than our own. These flexibilities are about ensuring that we have the tools and the autonomy to use the money that we have in the best possible way, in line with the needs and the priorities of the people that we serve. I'll explain in more detail why we need these flexibilities in a debate in the Senedd this afternoon. And I am very pleased that we've been able to jointly table a motion with all political parties represented in the Senedd, calling on the UK government to provide us with increased fiscal flexibilities. This isn't a political issue, it's a practical one. And we're putting our differences aside to make that pragmatic case jointly to the UK government. So I'll finish there and thank you very much for your time this morning. And I'm very happy, of course, to take questions. So first of all, we will go to Megan Boot. Megan's joining us on Zoom.
Thank you. Do you think this does enough to help councils protect the services that people rely upon?
I'm really grateful for that question. And as we set about establishing our draft budget, that work was taking place over the summer of last year, we set some core principles which would really inform all of the decisions which we took. And one of those was absolutely about protecting our core frontline public services, both the NHS and local government. At the spending review, we promised local government a 3.1% uplift next year. We were able to deliver that, and that's been very hard, and it has meant difficult decisions across the rest of government so that we can provide that funding to local government and to the NHS. But that said, we know local government is still going to be facing some really, really tough choices this year as they go about setting their budgets, which is why it's so important that they consult locally, that they have those conversations about how they set council tax, for example. We're doing the best that we can to put local government on a strong footing, and our budget this year, of course, builds on what have been very good settlements over the last couple of years. It was more than 9% 2 years ago, more than 7% in this financial year. So both of those have been baselined, so local government in Wales is in a much stronger position than their counterparts across the border in England, but we absolutely recognise, nonetheless, there will be still many tough choices that they're facing. I don't know, Megan, if you had another question or if we'll move on.
Thank you.
Okay, thank you, Megan. We're going to move now to Dan Davis, BBC Wales. He's joining us from Zoom as well.
Thanks, Minister. Can I just ask about the money that you're putting back into training schemes, React and so on? You just to be clear, there's still big cuts to that budget, even with the money you're putting back in. And you say that that is to support the steel sector, but if the money's just going into to React or any other general scheme, there is no guarantee, is there, that that money will be available to steel workers, or, you know, if it comes to it, steel workers who lose their jobs?
What we do want to guarantee is that the Welsh Government will always do its absolute level best to protect steel workers. And you can see that we have a long, strong track record of doing that over many years. Now, you're right that the funding is being provided to boost the apprenticeships programme in terms of looking at those cuts that we had intended to make, and then also looking at the employability support as well. And those programmes will be available for people across Wales who face losing their jobs, or who are looking for apprenticeship opportunities, perhaps to get into employment for the first time, or to change their employment. So those things will be available to people everywhere. What the Economy Minister has said is that he would be prepared to look again at his budgets should the worst come to the worst in Tata, and we need to take some action there. He would look again at his budgets to see what needed to be boosted. So I think that what we've done today is recognise as far as we can the pressures that those budget lines are facing, but also to reiterate really our strong commitment to workers at Tata.
Okay, thanks. I mean, the obvious follow-up is that, why don't you just contribute to the UK government's £100 million fund? But anyway, my second question was going to be on the Constitution. The McAllister and Williams final report has been published. Why are you still budgeting £1 million for constitutional reform next year?
So just to come back on the point that you made about Tata, I do have to emphasise that over many years Welsh Government has been investing in Tata, and particularly so in terms of the skills agenda in the steel sector, but then also in terms of decarbonisation as well. So, we have again a long track record of investing in our steel sector here in Wales, and that will continue through the apprenticeship support and so on. In terms of the constitutional work, you're right that the Constitutional Commission has reported. I found their recommendations, particularly on the fiscal flexibility side of things, to be particularly welcome. They recognise, I suppose, and repeat the kind of calls that the IFS, the WLGA and others have been making in that space as well. We've worked with Plaid Cymru and the designated member to explore how we might be able to make some additional allocations in the course of this budget. And this is one of those shared areas of interest and shared areas of priority. So we'll be publishing more detail really on what that £1 million will be delivering in the future. And we're also looking to the potential work around a justice observatory as well to continue to make the calls for further devolution in that space. So these are areas of shared interest with Plaid Cymru, which is why we thought it's right that we resource those through this final budget. Okay, we will move now to Hannah Thomas from Global.
Thank you, Minister. In your opening statement, you've outlined cuts, blamed austerity and a rise in inflation. And despite the extra monies from the UK government, it's still quite a gloomy forecast. The people of Britain have been told before by the UK government to hold their nerve. But can you today give the people of Wales a ray of hope? When will this be over? Or when can people start to see the light at the end of the tunnel? When will things actually start to improve?
That is a really good question, and unfortunately, if you look to what the experts are telling us about the outlook for public finances in future years, the future does look quite gloomy over the next couple of years, and a lot of that can be traced back, of course, to the mini budget, for example, and the disaster that has been for the economy here in Britain. So I think that things are going to be difficult, but I think that, the ray of hope really is the way we go about making those decisions. So, our Labour government here in Wales is obviously, as you can see in the budget, prioritising public services. We've listened to people, the things that they tell us matter to them the most, the NHS, those core frontline services that the councils deliver. We protected fundings going to schools, for example, the basic payment scheme for farmers to support our rural communities. All of those things have been absolutely at the heart of our budget. So I suppose, if anything, the ray of hope is the way we go about building those budgets on those set of important principles. But I don't want to suggest that the outlook is going to look rosy in terms of public finances in the next few years, because that's just not what the experts are telling us.
You mentioned in your answer there about sort of farming, helping farming communities, but in relation to these farming subsidies, we've seen, obviously many protests, go slow protests, so there's a lot of discontent. Isn't it now time to stop this proposal on the 20% of planting trees and for wildlife, so we can bring this to a conclusion? Is there a different way to bring sustainability into farming?
Thank you for what is a really, really important question. And I think that the first thing to do is obviously to recognise the concerns that the farming community have been raising with us and say, we've absolutely heard what they've been saying. The most important thing that people can do right now today is to have their say in the consultation. So those decisions haven't yet been made. We are absolutely listening to what the farming community is telling us. So everybody who's got an interest from an environmental perspective, from a farming perspective, and those two things are not different things. I think that it's important to recognise that as well. So they should have their say. I held the farming portfolio for a couple of years back from 2014 to 16. So it was a long time ago now, but I spent an awful lot of time on farms, and every time I would speak to farmers, they would tell me about how they really wanted to make sure that their farm was in good shape to hand on to the next generation. So I think it's important to recognise as well the care that farmers have for the environment and for their farms. So I think those discussions just need to keep going. I know there was a discussion between the FM and the Rural Affairs Minister with the farming community in Welshpool yesterday. I understand that was a very open and productive and honest discussion. So please have your say in the consultation as we move forward. And you know, I think there's another, well, at least a week left for people to have their say on that. Okay, so we'll move next to Sean Barry, and he's also joining us online via Zoom from Wales Online.
Hi, Minister. Thank you. At the time of the draft budget, you were putting out the case for capital, £100 million, to be converted into revenue in negotiations with the Treasury. So just an update on the outcome of that process. And also your borrowing powers. You have ability to borrow, I think, £1 billion over 5 years of capital. But since the Wales Act, I would say the Welsh Government's record on using its borrowing powers to its maximum is patchy at best, whereas the Scots have maximised their borrowing powers. So just an overview really on where you are in terms of using your borrowing powers in the current financial year and then for the financial year 24-25.
Yeah, really grateful for that question on borrowing. I think it's important to set out that the Welsh Government, every single year since we've had the ability to borrow, has planned in its budget, in its published budget, to borrow to the maximum. But what's happened at the end of financial years very often, it's happened in this financial year indeed, is that very, very late in the year, at supplementary estimates, which are normally in February, the UK government provides an additional boost. So it can be £100 million of additional capital. Equally, you can see, you know, the other years where we've had 100 million reduced from our budget in capital at the end of the year. So the unpredictability is a real problem for us there. So in those years where we've planned to borrow and then we get a big slug of capital at the end of the financial year, you appreciate you can't spend capital very quickly. So that money then means that we don't have to borrow in those years. It all speaks to the unpredictability of it all and why it's so good that we've got this cross-party motion in the chamber this afternoon. So I would, you know, push back on that that suggestion. Our record is patchy. We've always planned to borrow to the maximum. What we have been doing in the last couple of financial years actually is to over-program our capital. So we've over-programmed by £100 million to try and ensure that we do use that borrowing, and we have been able to use that borrowing as a result of that. But again, you know, these they're not the kind of ideal flexibilities that we need to manage our budget. And on the capital to revenue switch, we were making the case to manage our budget in this financial year when we had that £900 million pressure. We made the case to the UK government that we should be able to switch up to £200 million from capital to revenue. That would have helped us manage the budget. So for people who aren't familiar with all of this, capital is the money that you use for infrastructure. Revenue is what you pay your day-to-day bills with, pay bills and so on. So UK government said that they would give us only what the UK government provides to UK government Whitehall departments. So I mentioned supplementary estimates. That's the point at which you get your final budget for the year. So it's only at that very late point that we get our share of what's been agreed with UK government departments. The UK government will not agree a switch with us, but it will agree it with other departments. And we only get what falls out of the Barnett formula as a result of that. So again, that's something which isn't suitable for our needs. So that's why we've had this opportunity to talk across government and across parties. We've tabled alongside the Welsh Conservatives, Plaid Cymru and Liberal Democrats a motion in the Cynhadledd today, putting politics aside and calling on the UK government to improve our flexibilities to allow us to manage the budget better. So we don't have these issues so much around borrowing, and that we do have the ability to have some kind of system that allows us to have a capital to revenue switch, which Whitehall departments are allowed, but we aren't. So I'm really glad that we do have that cross-party support today. It's really important.
Okay, thank you. Can I just ask around priority spending going forward in 25-26, regardless of the political party of Westminster? I think the outlook will be challenging for devolved governments on the spending capacity. So is any thought being given now, Minister, to those funding projects you currently finance being scrapped in its entirety? I mean, elements of business support, it might be politically difficult, but, you know, free bus passes for the elderly. So my question is, are you looking at expenditure lines which might be taken out of your budget entirely?
So At the moment, so you mentioned 25-26, we don't have a budget for that year. What we are going to do is engage early, as we always do, with the UK government on its next comprehensive spending review period. We'll start that engagement in April of this year to try and make sure that we get our fair share, particularly in terms of rail funding, for example, those ongoing discussions around HS2 and so on. So at the moment, we've tried to look in this budget that we've tabled for the next financial year, look at those areas where it's a responsibility of the UK government, but we've tried to step in the past. So we have reduced our funding for PCSOs, for example, and that was a tough decision. We all recognise the value that they bring to our communities, but at the end of the day, that's the UK government's responsibility. And we have looked at other ways in which we can perhaps remodel our forecasts for uptake of various things, such as the childcare offer, and that's been able to release some funding as well. So we've tried really to protect as much as we possibly can, whilst having that focus on public services. It's you know, we've experienced austerity for so long. It's not as if we have a number of projects that we can just look to and make cuts to. Nothing that we do doesn't matter to somebody here in Wales. So we've tried to really focus on those public services as far as possible. But there have been some tough choices, certainly. Okay, we'll move now to Jess Payne, Bauer Media, and she's here with us in the room.
Yes, we spoke to a toy shop yesterday in Cardiff, and they said that they were at a tipping point and the change in business rates might prove devastating. Have you got any words of reassurance for them?
So just for background, for anybody who's not familiar with this, we've been providing temporary rate relief support for people who fall for businesses in the retail, hospitality and leisure sector since the pandemic. We've provided over £1 billion of support, but that support was always intended to be temporary. It's not something that business was been planning on at all for the next financial year, because it was assumed it would come to an end in any case. So we've, as I said, faced some really, really difficult choices with the budget, and our priority has been protecting public services. The NHS in Wales will have a 4% uplift compared to less than 1% across the border in England. But I think the situation you've described gives an example of one of the tough choices that we've had to make. Nonetheless, we will be providing 40% rates relief to those businesses in that sector. But let's remember, around half of businesses in Wales pay no rates whatsoever in any case. Only around 1 in 5 will actually pay their full entitlement, because we do have a really generous system of support for businesses. It's worth, in the next financial year, around £1/3 billion. That's an awful lot of rates relief support that we're providing. So, you know, I do understand that this decision not to be able to provide a full 75% will be disappointing to businesses, but it is one of the tough choices that we've made in terms of just making sure that the NHS has what it needs to keep going.
Yeah, thank you. You've also described this budget as stark, dire, and a lot of that blame has been put onto the UK government. We are expecting a general election coming up. What are you hoping to hear from the major parties to help?
Okay, just to clarify, the circumstances are dire, the budget's not dire. So things that we would really want to see from a UK government would be practical things. We're realistic really about the outlook for public finances over the next few years, having listened to what the experts have been telling us. So one thing that we really want to see from a UK government of any colour would be better fiscal flexibilities for the Welsh Government. So just to think ahead to the debate that we've got in the Chamber this afternoon, all parties are agreeing that Wales needs to be able to access its reserve, the full reserve in any financial year. So we're able to carry a reserve, which is basically your bank account, of just £350 million. That's absolutely tiny in the context of a £23 billion budget. So we need to be able to access all of that if we need to in any financial year. There are quite rigid rules at the moment as to how much you're able to draw down. And actually that reserve is worth 23% less than it was at the time it was set. So we need to have a system whereby the reserve increases in line with inflation in order to help us manage our budget in that space. And I've talked a little bit about borrowing powers. So we're keen to have the overall limit on borrowing increased, but then our annual limits increased. So at the moment, we're only allowed to borrow £150 million. So those are some of the practical things I think the UK government could do of any colour. They could do it overnight. They've done it for Scotland. They've improved the situation for Northern Ireland. I think that it is quite stark now that Wales is being ignored on those important fronts, which is why that cross-party support is so important. Okay, and finally we're going to David Nicholson, Morning Star, and he's on Zoom.
Morning, Minister. The PCS union are holding a demonstration and rally outside the Senate today, protesting about the cuts to museums and galleries of Wales and the depth of those cuts and what it will mean for staffing levels and to the art collections of Wales. Is there anything, any message of hope you can offer them?
We have made some really tough choices in the budget, and some of those do impact on our cultural arm's length bodies. The final budget does include an additional 1.4 million for Cadw and the Royal Commission. So now that brings it up to parity in terms of reductions across the other cultural arm's length bodies of 10.5%. But absolutely, we appreciate that that is one of the tough choices that we've made in the budget. And there are very few areas that we've been able to offer protection to, even with a 3.1% uplift to the RSG, which has recently increased to 3.3% as a result of some of the decisions that I've been announcing today. That's still going to make tough choices for local government. There's no part of the public sector which isn't going to be affected, unfortunately. We have tried to protect jobs as far as possible, but I don't want to suggest that we're going to be able to solve all of the tough choices, because our budget's worth so much less than it was at the time it was set.
Okay, and the Wales TUC has made a suggestion to the Welsh Government that one way in the medium to long term that money can be saved from the Welsh Government's budget is to bring services back in-house so the profit doesn't leak out of the system from the public sector. You said at the time you thought it was a good idea. What action is being taken by Welsh Government to in-source those services that you can?
So one of the things that we have been doing is looking at providing a toolkit and a guide for organisations in terms of bringing things back in-house, and particularly this would be in local government. So we've been working with Compass as it is now in order to deliver that kind of toolkit so that organisations can understand the things that they need to be considering and the benefits of bringing things in-house. So of course we need to look at that ourselves as Welsh Government too, and I know that that's something that the Deputy Minister who's responsible for this particular area will be taking a keen interest in. Okay, so I think that brings us to the end of the press conference today, so thank you very much for joining us.